My name is Julian Mercer, and the first public humiliation of my life didn't happen in a courtroom or a police station. It happened at my wedding. Silver Pines Chapel was full that morning. The aisle gleamed under soft winter light. When the MC called the groom's name, the camera instinctively swept toward my side of the room and stopped. 3 full rows, completely empty. No parents, no brothers, no last-minute rush through the doors, just absence clean and unmistakable. A whisper drifted from somewhere behind me. Did his family refuse to come? Before I could steady my breath, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from my father sent while I stood at the altar. "You embarrassed this family long enough. Don't use our name again." I hadn't even locked my screen when the chapel doors opened at the back. 2 police officers stepped inside. Guests turned. The music faltered. My father followed, not looking at me. They spoke quietly at first. Then the words landed: trespassing and financial fraud. Preliminary accusations. Enough to stain a day. Enough to make people stare. In that moment, it became clear this wasn't an impulse. It was arranged, timed, built to break me in public. That was the moment I understood my family wasn't done with me. The chapel settled back into a fragile stillness after the doors closed. Outside, the mountains stood buried in snow, their slopes catching the pale winter light and throwing it back through the tall windows in long, colorless streaks. It felt colder than it should have, even with the heaters running. The light didn't warm anything. It only sharpened the edges of the room, made every empty seat impossible to ignore. Julia's hand tightened around mine. It was steady, deliberate. The kind of grip that says I'm here without needing words. In that moment, she was the only thing anchoring me to my own body. Without her, I think I would have drifted out of the chapel, out of the day, out of myself. I kept my eyes forward, fixed on the altar, on the place we were supposed to begin something clean and new. But I could feel it. The weight of being erased. 3 rows. An entire side of the room reserved for my family left untouched. No coats slung over chairs, no familiar faces leaning out to catch my eye. Just space. Open, deliberate space. I had known somewhere deep down that they might not come. Still seeing it laid out like that, so public, so final, hit differently. It wasn't private rejection anymore. It was a statement made in front of everyone we knew. I felt eyes on me. Not cruel, not unkind, but curious. Kind of curiosity that stings, because it doesn't mean harm. It means confusion. People trying to understand what kind of man stands at his own wedding without a family behind him. I kept my shoulders straight. I refused to bow under it. But inside, something hollow widened, slow and quiet. This wasn't the first time I'd been cut out. That realization came without drama, like an old truth finally deciding to speak up. There had been holidays where my calls went unanswered. Birthdays acknowledged days late, if at all. Long stretches where my name simply didn't come up anymore. I had told myself it was distance, pride, time. But standing there under that cold light, I couldn't avoid the question that surfaced again and again. Was I ever really part of them? The officiant cleared his throat gently and continued. The ceremony moved forward because that's what ceremonies do. They don't stop for absence. Vows were spoken, rings exchanged. Julia smiled up at me, her eyes damp but unwavering. And I mirrored it because she deserved that much. She deserved a moment untouched by whatever fracture I carried into that room. And yet the air felt divided, like a line had been drawn straight down the aisle, separating what was present from what had chosen to stay away. I could feel it in my chest, that faint pressure that comes when something unresolved is about to demand its due. As we walked back down the aisle together, applause rose around us, warm and genuine. But beneath it, I sensed something else beginning to move. Quiet, patient, and waiting. The absence hadn't ended with the ceremony. It had marked me, and I didn't yet understand how deeply it would reach into the days that followed, or how that empty space would soon be filled, not with reconciliation, but with accusation. 5 years before the chapel, before the empty rows and the police at my wedding, there was a storm that changed everything. It came down hard and fast, the kind of winter storm that swallows roads and sound at the same time. Snow fell sideways, driven by wind that howled through the trees like it had a grievance of its own. Our family property sat on the edge of town, half rural, half forgotten. Behind the house stood an old storage building, more shed than structure, its roof already bowed from years of neglect. That night, the weight finally won. I remember the sound first. A deep, splitting crack that cut through the wind, followed by a heavy, hollow collapse. The shed caved in on itself, beams snapping under the snow load. My father was already outside, boots sinking into drifts as he shouted orders over the storm. He'd spent most of his life around emergencies, and in moments like that, he defaulted to command. "Get the equipment out," he yelled at me. "The old fire gear, now." Inside that shed was a set of outdated firefighting equipment he'd kept long after it stopped being useful. Rusted tanks, scorched jackets, tools no one else wanted. To him, it was history, proof of who he had been. I ran toward the door, shoulder against warped wood snow, stinging my face as I forced it open. That's when I heard it. A voice, raw panicked, cut through the wind. A man shouting for help from the far end of the property. The old caretaker's cabin sat there, half hidden by trees, and the sound came from inside. The storm hadn't just brought down the shed. It had trapped someone. For a fraction of a second, everything inside me stalled. My father's order rang in my ears. The equipment, the gear, the thing he wanted saved. But the voice came again, hoarse and breaking, and something older than obedience took over. I ran. The cabin door was jammed, snow packed into the frame. I threw my weight against it until it gave splintering inward. Inside, the air was cold and sharp with dust. A man lay pinned under a fallen beam, his leg twisted at an angle that told me he hadn't been able to move for a while. His face was gray with fear, eyes wide when he saw me. I don't remember thinking. I remember acting. I braced the beam pulled until my muscles screamed, dragged him free, inch by inch. The roof groaned above us as we stumbled back into the storm snow, filling the space where we'd been seconds earlier. By the time we reached the house, the shed was gone, completely collapsed, the equipment buried beneath timber and ice. My father stood there, staring at the wreckage. I waited for something, relief maybe, a nod, anything that said I'd done the right thing. Instead, his eyes shifted to me, sharp and cold. There was no thank you, no acknowledgement of the man standing behind me, shaking but alive. Just anger. I saw it settle into his face as clearly as if he'd spoken it out loud. The loss of that equipment wasn't an accident to him. It was a theft, something taken, and he needed someone to carry the blame. His gaze lingered on me, and in that moment, I understood I'd crossed an invisible line. That choice, the one I would make again without hesitation, rewrote my place in this family. I didn't know it then. I only felt the distance start to form thin at first, like ice spreading across a lake. But it would harden over time, and years later, it would be the reason no one stood for me at my own wedding. The truth didn't surface all at once. It arrived quietly, the way uncomfortable truths often do, through someone who had no reason to protect the lie. It was Mrs. Klein who finally said it out loud. She had lived next to my parents' place for more than 20 years, long enough to see patterns most people missed. One afternoon, months after the storm, she caught me as I was loading boxes into my car. Her voice was low, careful, as if she were testing whether the words were safe to release. She told me my father was carrying more debt than anyone realized. Personal loans. Old balances that never seemed to shrink. Bills he shuffled from one envelope to another, like a game he could still win if he moved fast enough. The firefighting equipment, the same rusted gear he'd insisted I save that night, wasn't just sentimental. It was collateral. Hearing that shifted something inside me. The loss of the equipment hadn't just been a blow to his pride. It had been the loss of leverage, of control. Without it, the loans tightened. The margins disappeared. And my father, who had built his identity around being the man who handled crises, suddenly had one he couldn't command. That was when the story changed. To the neighbors, he framed the night as a betrayal. He said I'd ignored him, that I'd chosen to play the hero instead of following orders, that I'd cost the family something irreplaceable. The details varied depending on who was listening, but the conclusion stayed the same. I couldn't be trusted when it mattered. To my brothers, the version was sharper. I'd put a stranger before blood. I'd acted alone. I'd made a decision that hurt all of them. It was easier to shape the narrative that way, to turn a financial collapse into a moral failure with a single convenient villain. Me. No one asked what I'd heard that night. No one asked why I ran. They didn't need to. The story worked better without those questions. At first, I tried to talk. I explained what happened calmly more than once. I thought if I laid out the facts, something would shift. Instead, I was met with silence. Calls went unanswered. Messages were left unread, then not even that. It was a quiet kind of erasure, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but becomes impossible to ignore. Weeks turned into months, months into years. The family adjusted. Birthdays passed without my name mentioned. Decisions were made without my input. I learned about things after they'd already happened: repairs, sales holidays, if I learned about them at all. It wasn't dramatic. There were no explosive arguments, just absence slowly normalized. I told myself they needed space. That time might soften whatever had hardened between us. But deep down, I could feel the truth settling in. They weren't waiting for reconciliation. They were practicing life without me. I became the cautionary example. The brother you don't bring up. The son whose choices proved something was wrong. And the longer the silence stretched, the easier it became to let it stay that way. Looking back, that was the real fracture. Not the storm, not the equipment. It was the decision, quiet and collective, to rewrite me as expendable. Once that took hold, everything else followed naturally. Accusations, distance. The willingness years later to let police officers walk into my wedding and say my name like it belonged on a report instead of a marriage license. By the time I understood what had really been lost that night, it wasn't just the gear. It was my place, and my family had already learned how to live without it. I still sent the invitations, even after the years of silence, even after the storm and everything that followed it. I told myself that a wedding was different, that it carried a weight other moments didn't, that maybe putting it in writing in my own hand would matter. I addressed one envelope to my parents' house and added a second sheet inside. A short letter. Nothing dramatic. No accusations. Just a few honest lines saying I was getting married, that I wanted them there, that the door was open if they wanted to walk through it. I sealed it carefully, as if care alone could protect what was inside. For a week, I checked the mailbox more than I needed to. Not with excitement, just with a kind of restrained vigilance. I told myself not to read into the waiting. People were busy. Mail got delayed. Silence didn't always mean rejection. Then the envelope came back. It was unmistakable. My handwriting, my stamp. The edges were slightly curled where snow had melted and dried again. The seal was intact. They hadn't even opened it. I stood in the kitchen holding it longer than made sense, turning it over as if there might be an explanation hidden on the back. There wasn't. My phone buzzed that evening. A message from my brother Simon. No greeting, no preamble. Stop pretending you're still one of us. That was it. No follow-up. No room for misinterpretation. The words landed cleanly and stayed there, heavy and final. Whatever small hope I'd protected all those years didn't shatter. It drained. Quietly. Completely. Julia found me later sitting at the table with the envelope flattened under my palm. She didn't ask questions right away. She just watched my face the way people do when they already know something's wrong and don't want to rush it. When I finally handed her the envelope unopened, she understood more than I'd said out loud. She started noticing things after that. The way my phone never rang with familiar numbers. The way I avoided certain topics without realizing I was doing it. The careful way I spoke about my family like someone describing a place they'd once lived but couldn't return to. I didn't try again. That matters more than it sounds. I didn't send another letter. I didn't call. I didn't show up unannounced, with explanations ready. Something inside me finally recognized the pattern for what it was. Effort on only one side stops being reconciliation and turns into permission. Standing there with that envelope, I understood this was the last attempt. Not because I didn't care anymore, but because caring without being met had started to cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. My sense of self, my stability, the quiet trust I was trying to build with Julia separate from the damage I carried. The wedding went forward because it had to, because it was ours. But the returned invitation stayed with me, folded back into its envelope and tucked into a drawer I didn't open often, not as evidence. As a reminder, hope can survive distance, it can survive time, but it can't survive being sent back unopened. The notice didn't arrive with sirens or raised voices. It came the way real damage often does, quietly in a plain envelope left at the edge of an ordinary day. I found it tucked between grocery flyers and a utility bill, the return address stamped with the county seal. My name was printed cleanly across the front, too clean. Inside was an official notification requesting my presence for questioning. No dramatic language, just facts. An allegation had been filed, accusing me of misappropriating medical funds registered under my mother's name. I read it twice before the word settled. The account they referenced wasn't one I recognized. Not vaguely, not even as a distant memory. I had never had access to my mother's finances, never signed on her behalf, never been listed on anything tied to her care. The letter cited a series of withdrawals spread over months, framed as a pattern. Enough to look intentional, enough to justify suspicion. What stunned me most wasn't the accusation. It was how neatly it fit. Attached were copies of documents, bank summaries, authorization forms. And there it was at the bottom of the page. My father's signature, or something meant to look like it. The name was right. The pressure wasn't. The lines were smooth where his hand had always shaken. The curve of the letters felt rehearsed careful in a way his writing had never been. At the station, I was directed to a small interview room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Officer Reeves introduced himself and slid the file across the table between us. He wasn't aggressive. If anything, he seemed restrained, observant. He asked routine questions first, where I worked, how often I visited my parents' property, whether I had ever handled my mother's medical bills. I answered plainly, no, never. As I spoke, he watched my face more than his notes, like he was listening for something beneath the answers. When he reached the signature page, he paused. "This is your father's?" he asked. "That's what they're saying," I replied. He nodded slowly, then tapped the paper with a finger. "It's consistent," he said, choosing the word carefully, "but not identical." That was the first time I felt something shift. Not relief. Not yet. Just the faint recognition that someone else saw the seam where the story had been stitched together too tightly. Reeves asked about my relationship with my family. I kept it factual. I didn't volunteer emotion. Years in emergency work had taught me how quickly feeling could be mistaken for instability. Still, as I spoke, I felt a familiar realization settle in heavy, unsurprising. They needed a criminal, and I was convenient. A son already distanced. A name that could be isolated. Someone whose absence from family life could be reframed as motive. It wasn't personal in the way people imagine betrayal to be. It was practical. As the interview ended, Reeves told me the case would be reviewed further. He didn't promise anything. He didn't need to. The damage had already begun. Allegations don't have to be proven to take something from you. They just have to exist. Walking out into the cold air, I felt the same hollow pressure I'd felt at my wedding. Different setting, same message. My family wasn't reaching out. They were reaching for leverage. And this time, they were willing to let the law do the talking for them. Once the accusation existed, it began to generate its own gravity. Every detail that followed seemed to pull toward the same center, drawing in fragments that had once felt unrelated. I started with the account statements. Not because I believed they would clear me, but because I needed to understand the shape of the lie. The withdrawals were small enough to avoid immediate attention. A few $100s here, a few there, spread out over months, never spiking high enough to trigger alarms. But when I laid them out chronologically, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Each cluster lined up with moments I remembered clearly, times when Simon's construction business stalled, when Paul lost his contract and quietly moved back into my parents' house. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was need mapped onto opportunity. One transfer stood out. A modest amount attributed to me by name. According to the record, it had been initiated late at night on a weekday. The implication was obvious secrecy intent. But that night was one of the easiest to disprove. I pulled my location history without hesitation. My GPS placed me in another state, nearly 600 miles away, working a logistics deployment that ran through the early morning. I hadn't been anywhere near the house, the bank, or the account. Someone hadn't just taken money. They'd assigned it a face. The next piece arrived the following afternoon, folded once and slipped through the mail slot. No stamp, no return address, just my name written by hand. The paper was cheap, the ink pressed hard enough to leave grooves behind the letters. The message was short, directive. It warned me to stop asking questions, to let things resolve quietly. The tone wasn't angry, it was managerial. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to Paul. Seeing it in ink did something that digital threats never quite manage. It made the intent feel physical, deliberate. I realized then that this wasn't about intimidation alone. It was about control. They wanted me uncertain, off balance, reacting instead of thinking. Mrs. Klein filled in the rest without meaning to. When I asked if she'd noticed anything unusual around the old house, she hesitated only briefly. Then she told me she'd seen unfamiliar cars in the driveway more than once. People coming and going at odd hours. Not visitors, not contractors, just movement. Activity that didn't belong to a place supposedly tightening its belt. The picture sharpened. This wasn't one brother acting recklessly. It wasn't my father making a desperate call in isolation. It was coordination. Each person holding a piece. Each playing a role that only worked if the others stayed in line. I thought back to the wedding, to the empty seats, to the message sent at the altar. The absence hadn't been passive. It had been preparation. Standing there with the evidence spread out across my kitchen table, I felt something settle that surprised me with its clarity. Not fear, not even anger. Understanding. They hadn't lost control by accident. They had reorganized it. And in that reorganization, I had been assigned a function. Scapegoat, buffer, someone to absorb the consequences while they stabilized themselves. It was a plan built to look organic. Financial strain, family tension, a son who drifted away. All believable, all deniable. Except the seams were showing now. I folded the handwritten note carefully and set it aside. Not as a threat, but as proof. For the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was watching. And I knew with a certainty that left no room for doubt that whatever came next wouldn't be accidental. This wasn't chaos. It was a system. The knock came early, sharp enough to cut through the last thin layer of sleep. When I opened the door, the cold rushed in first, followed by 2 uniformed officers and my father standing just behind them. He didn't greet me. He didn't hesitate either. One of the officers explained that a report had been filed alleging trespass on my parents' property. My father nodded along as if he were confirming the weather. He said he'd found evidence. He said it had been captured on the backyard camera. He said it calmly, with the same controlled tone he'd used his whole life when he wanted something to sound inevitable. Officer Reeves stepped forward and asked to see the footage. My father pulled out his phone and handed it over. The video was grainy, recorded at night. A hooded figure crossed the edge of the frame, moving quickly past the shed toward the back fence. The timestamp matched one of the withdrawals from the account. The implication hung there, heavy and deliberate. Reeves watched it twice, then a third time. He paused the frame where the figure stopped briefly under the motion light. "How tall are you?" he asked me. I told him. He glanced back at the screen, then at me again. The difference wasn't dramatic, but it was there. Subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking for it. Clear enough once you were. He crouched near the edge of the yard and studied the ground, still marked with faint impressions from the previous night's frost. "What size do you wear?" he asked. When I answered, his expression tightened. The prints near the fence were several sizes larger. Too large to explain away with heavy boots or thick socks. Too precise to ignore. My father shifted his weight, just slightly. Reeves handed the phone back and asked how the footage had been retrieved. The camera system had been installed years ago. He remembered my mother managing it. Passwords written down, reset codes lost. My father had never been patient with technology. There was a pause. Then he said Simon had sent him the clip. The room seemed to contract around that admission. Reeves asked how Simon accessed the footage. My father didn't have an answer that held. He looked past the officers toward the street, anywhere but at me. When Reeves asked for the original file, not the forwarded version, the metadata told the rest of the story. The timestamp had been altered. The file had been edited before it ever reached the police. Reeves didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He explained calmly that the sequence of transfers didn't align with standard security uploads, that the footage had passed through multiple devices. That meant intent. My father stood there while it unraveled. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just watched the explanation dismantle what he'd brought them piece by piece. And in that moment, I saw something I hadn't expected. Avoidance. When our eyes finally met, he looked away. It wasn't shame exactly. It was something quieter, a little smaller, the look of someone who had committed fully to a version of events and couldn't retreat without acknowledging what it cost. I realized then that this wasn't about truth for him. It was about follow-through. The officers stepped aside to discuss next steps. Reeves told me they'd need additional review, that nothing was conclusive. That was the language of caution, but the meaning was clear enough. As they left, my father lingered by the door. He didn't speak. Neither did I. There was nothing left that hadn't already been said through his actions. When he finally turned away, I understood something with painful clarity. He hadn't brought the police to ask questions. He'd brought them, hoping they wouldn't. The next blow didn't come from my family directly. It came through my work. I was halfway through a routine morning when my supervisor asked me to step into a conference room. His tone was careful, in the way people get when they don't want to alarm you, but don't want to lie either. Someone, he said, had contacted the company requesting a background verification. Then another call followed. And another. Each one framed as a concern. Each one asking the same quiet questions about my reliability, my access to sensitive information, my judgment. By the end of the day, an anonymous complaint landed in HR's system. It didn't accuse me outright. That was the clever part. It raised concerns, suggested patterns, implied risk, enough to trigger review protocols without naming a crime. I recognized the strategy immediately. My father had always believed that the easiest way to damage someone wasn't to prove them guilty, it was to make people hesitate around them. I went home with the familiar pressure building behind my ribs, the sense that something essential was being slowly compressed. That evening, the mail brought something worse. A medical bill addressed to my mother, forwarded to my name. The payment had already been processed. The account listed as the source wasn't one I recognized, but it carried my personal information. Someone had opened it in my name. Someone had paid her hospital expenses through it. Clean, documented, traceable. It was the kind of evidence that didn't need explanation. It explained itself. I drove straight to Dr. Harlan's office the next morning. He had treated my mother for years. When I showed him the bill, his expression shifted not to surprise, but to recognition. He pulled her file, flipped through it carefully, asked, and then looked at me with something close to regret. She never authorized those payments, he said. She didn't even know the accounts existed. He told me she'd been confused the last few visits, asking why certain bills were already marked paid, wondering aloud if she'd forgotten something. She hadn't. The paperwork wasn't hers. The signatures weren't either. Before I left, Dr. Harlan hesitated, then reached into a drawer. He handed me a small notebook he'd been asked to store months earlier just in case. My mother had brought it in herself, worried it might get lost at home. It was a ledger, page after page of handwritten notes, loan amounts, dates, names. Every entry ended the same way in careful script. Simon, Paul. And on the last page, written smaller than the rest, almost tucked into the margin, a single line. Don't tell Julian. I sat in my car for a long time after that, the notebook resting on the passenger seat like something alive. The accusations had been damaging. The threats had been frightening. But this was different. This wasn't about money or leverage or control. This was about protection. My mother had been shielding them, quietly, at her own expense. And they had repaid that by turning her confusion into cover her care into camouflage. They had let me take the weight of something she'd been carrying alone. That realization hurt more than any charge ever could, because it meant the plan wasn't just legal or financial. It was intimate. It reached into places that were supposed to be off limits. And for the first time since this began, I understood the full shape of what I was up against. They weren't just trying to destroy my credibility. They were trying to bury the truth where no one would think to look. The county courthouse didn't look dramatic from the outside. Beige stone, narrow windows, a flag moving stiffly in the cold air. It was the kind of building designed to feel ordinary, almost forgettable, until you stepped inside and realized how many lives had been quietly bent within its walls. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled, fluorescent lights that flattened everything beneath them. My father sat at the far table, shoulders squared, hands folded as if discipline alone could still control the outcome. Simon and Paul were there too, seated behind him, close enough to be counted as support, far enough to avoid responsibility. I stood alone. The proceedings moved without ceremony. GPS records were entered, first time-stamped logs showing exactly where I had been on the nights in question. Miles away, in another state, on assignment. A technician walked the panel through the data slowly, methodically, leaving no room for interpretation. The timeline didn't bend. It held. Then came the technical analysis of the video. Officer Reeves testified, calmly explaining how metadata works, how timestamps can be altered, how files leave fingerprints when they pass through multiple devices. The clip my father had brought in was no longer just suspicious. It was compromised, intentionally. The room shifted when the witness they hadn't expected was called. A man I barely recognized took the stand. He spoke carefully at first, eyes fixed on the table. He explained how he'd been paid to cross the yard late at night to trigger the camera to create the illusion of a break-in. He named Simon as the one who contacted him, said the instructions were simple. No confrontation, no theft, just movement, just proof. When the medical records were introduced, the air changed again. Dr. Harlan's testimony was brief but precise. He confirmed my mother had no knowledge of the accounts opened in her name, that she had never authorized the loans, that her confusion had been documented long before the accusations against me began. The ledger followed. Page by page, the pattern was laid bare. The loans, the repayments that never came. The final line read aloud carried more weight than anything else that morning. Don't tell Julian. No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to argue. The panel recessed briefly, then returned with a decision delivered in the same measured tone the room had maintained all morning. Every accusation was dismissed. The evidence was fabricated. The complaint was unfounded. The case was closed. When they asked if I wished to say anything, I stood. My hands didn't shake. I wasn't angry. I wasn't relieved. I was tired in a way that felt permanent. I didn't take from my family, I said. I survived them. I didn't look at my father when I spoke. I didn't need to. The silence around him told me everything I hadn't wanted to know. He stared straight ahead as if the room had emptied and taken his sons with it. Simon's jaw tightened. Astari. Paul wouldn't lift his head. There was no apology, no collapse, no final confrontation. Just quiet. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment longer than necessary, letting the cold remind me I was still here. Still intact. Behind me, the doors closed softly, sealing the end of something that had been breaking for years. Families don't always explode. Sometimes they unravel so slowly that by the time the thread finally snaps, there's nothing left to gather. There's a lesson I didn't learn from the accusations or the courtroom. I learned it in the quieter moments afterward when nothing was chasing me anymore and I had to sit with what remained. I learned that loyalty doesn't always wear the face of family, and that survival sometimes means walking away from the people who taught you how to endure. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but because staying would slowly erase you. For a long time, I believed that if I explained myself clearly enough, if I waited long enough, something would soften. That understanding would eventually show up. What I understand now is that clarity doesn't fix relationships built on fear and control. And silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of protection rather than loss. If this story brought up something familiar for you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. You're welcome to share them in the comments, only if you feel ready. And if you'd like to support this channel, a like or a subscription means more than you might realize. Thank you for listening and for giving this story a place to land.